colleagues. As a matter of fact, I should say, bhaiyo, behno. Welcome to this new webinar on people's participation in city planning. And what we try to do is, how do we use bottom-up processes to create inclusive and people-centric planning cities is what we are essentially trying to examine today. Let me tell you that this is 48th of the 60 webinar series we are running. And this is going on still since June last year. So we probably are in our 9th month of running these webinars. Every month we have on average done 4 or 5 webinars. And I must very briefly tell you why we are doing this webinar series. What is the purpose? What is the objective? What we're trying to kind of achieve. As you all know, urban challenge in India is very daunting. Not only in India, in Asia, it's a very daunting challenge. And when you say this challenge is daunting, you don't have to kind of go very far to look at areas in which you have huge problems. And you could look at water, and you could look at finance, and look at governance, and look at slums, and housing, and climate change, and infrastructure. Just look at anything. And in Indian context, if you look at the statistical profile of this challenge, you realize how daunting they are. If you look at the people side, if you look at the demography, you find out that, while we were something like 375, 380 million people in 2011, we will be about 520 million people in 2030, and we'll be somewhere around 840 million people in 2050. If you're looking at finance and finance for infrastructure development, we are talking about, and several studies mentioned, McKinsey and others, that India requires $640 billion in the next 20 years in order to kind of look after its infrastructure development need. And now this $640 billion must be seen in the context of $14 billion we were able to spend in 10 years under JNNURM, and that to huffing and puffing. So it's a whole issue of resource management, the whole issue of capacity building. If you look at pollution, Delhi continues to remain one of the worst polluted cities anywhere in the world. Look at any statistics, any story, Delhi would be seen as one. If you look at slums, Mumbai perhaps is the only city where a graph of people living in slums is taller than the graph of people living in ordinary houses. And I think, you could just go on and on and on. Now, what one is saying is this, that and cities are not only difficulties, this is not only problem, cities also have a huge promise. That is where the future is. That is where I think, the economy is, even while 32% of the people live in cities, they were producing something like 68% of the GDP. So they're also engines of economic growth. Now, that being the case, it's absolutely essential that we meet urban challenge squarely. Because if you're found wanting or underperforming in the context of meeting the urban challenge, we will be paying a very big price as a country. Not only quality of large number of people will suffer, and I already talked about 840 million people by 2050, not only large number of people who are in the villages and aspiring to change their lives, their ambition and their aspiration will suffer, And if you're talking about $5 trillion economy from 2.92 trillion economy that we have at this point of time, that will suffer a major setback. So it's not only economy, it's not only quality of life, it's just about everything. And therefore, it's absolutely important that we succeed in terms of meeting our urban challenge. Now, what one is saying is this, and this is the important message, that meeting this urban challenge is not something that government can and should think of doing alone. Meeting this challenge requires a wider societal partnership. Large number of stakeholders need to come together, work together, and we've got to kind of create multiple platforms where it happens. We must mobilize the resources and intellectual abilities outside the system. We must share, we must co-work, we must create new solutions, because it's very, very clear that the old solutions are not going to work. Now, this webinar series that we are running for last 9 months essentially is a very modest and mild effort in that direction. It's trying to create platform. It's trying to bring people together. It's trying to kind of take urban challenge, so to speak, to the town hall. It's taking to the community. And we had fairly interesting things. Just where I mentioned 48, we had over 250 speakers who come and spoken from all over. We have handled or addressed anywhere between 45 to 50 themes and sub-themes, and a large number of professionals, even community people have come and attended. And I believe this is just a small beginning. There's a huge amount of things remain to be done. So it is in this context that we are running this webinar series. And today's webinar is very important. We have a very impressive multinational panel, including people from Brazil and Philippines. And we look forward to a very vibrant, very educative, and very enlightened discussion today. So with that introductory statement, I hand over to Aravind, who is moderating this webinar to start the process. Thank you, Aravind, and thank you, panelists, and thank you all those who are present here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirti, for the introduction and for giving a very good idea on the INHAF series of webinars that we've had. This is the 48th one, and even if it's the 48th one, and I'm sure you'll have many more, this is a very, very important one, and welcoming everyone with a good afternoon here in India, and for Fabricio and friends who are joining us from Brazil, probably good morning, a very early good morning to you. And for Mary, who's joining us from Manila, Philippines, good evening, and evening to all other friends who are joining from other parts of the world. So what I'll do, Kirtiji, is that I'll just lay the context of why are we having a webinar on this? Why are we having a discussion on this at the moment? And the why and what of the webinar, and also introduce our panelists, and then take it forward. So a lot of us who are here are of course here from the space of practice, and with a lot of engagement on city planning and urban planning, and also engagement from the side of civil society and people's engagement with the whole process. So that is the primary sort of approach to looking at people's participation and engagement in the city planning context, for us at least. And Here, I would just like to lay the broad contours in the form of a couple of um, uh, what are we talking of when we say people's engagement, and what are we meaning when we say city planning or urban planning. So I'll just lay that out for everyone's benefit. Firstly, that we all know of how urban planning, at least in the global south, has now almost formal urban planning, state-led urban planning processes have completed almost 100 years now. The first initial planning acts that we have in our country are from around 1920s, 1950s, and we've almost crossed 100 years. Even though they were originally rooted in colonial practice of governing the populations, controlling the populations, and has a very colonial imperial sort of uh, origin. And even though it comes or is born at that time, but all our planning practice and frameworks now have adopted it as more of a accepted democratic part of our urban governance. So when you speak about 1950s, 60s, those were the first years where we started firstly interacting with our with formal planning mechanisms like master plans. The TCPOs were constituted at that time. We had different development authorities that were established for the first time. So now when you look at, let's say, 60, 70 years of our urban planning frameworks, we can easily say that it is accepted. It is accepted within the 74th constitutional amendment, where every urban local body in India is supposed to be planning for its urban centers. It's part of our governance framework. But what we see is very clearly that, like any other tool, urban planning still kind of is is um is is controlled, so to say, by definitely by the state. The formal urban planning mechanism is definitely controlled by the state, which shares that control not with people but with elite groups, with groups that kind of retrench the existing inequalities in our cities, with caste, class, and gender biases that are very evident. Formal urban planning practices leave out 70 to 80% of informal urban manifestations that are there in our city. So we can clearly see that our urban planning frameworks have not managed to address people and their engagement in the whole process. And what we see, and what we experience in our civil society engagement is primarily exchange from the state to the people in the form of information sharing at the best. Usually planning practice is away and far distant from the people and communities that we're talking about. So at best we are having some sort of information exchange, and in some little cases of our engagement in the select cities that our friends are going to be sharing about, we have selective consultative processes that leave out a huge population of people, marginalized groups, communities who are contributing in their different ways, but they are not taken, and their suggestions are not taken into the formal planning mechanisms. So that is the first sort of big framework that we are dealing with, of people's lack of engagement in urban planning. Second is of how a lot of groups look at master plans, for instance. So we have to understand that every city in India has about, at least in the minimum of 5 to 6 planning agencies or bodies that have got something to do with urban or city planning or city development. But bigger cities, you have 15 to 20 agencies even dealing with city development processes. So you have many plans, you have many planning bodies, mechanisms, so on and so forth. But we are very specifically wanting to look at master plans that are more legal, so to say, and have a very strong statutory sort of people's engagement process. That said, even though they are legally more binding, more has a strong statutory backing, what we've experienced over the past many years, especially in the last 20 years, is that these plans are now being overridden and being subsumed, I would say, rather, under schemes, under special projects. But these plans are gradually being receded in the background, and there are many schools of thought that we have at the moment, where one school of thought also says that, guys, why are you even engaging with this process? It is not the most important planning tool or space in the city at the moment. And it's actually better if the state is doing plans that are not implementable in the first place, because that will allow the urban poor worker groups to kind of ensure that through the lack of implementation, they are able to reclaim and stay put in the urban center. So that is the one school of thought. But we are very clear, at least in the engagements that we have had from the civil society organization side, is that whilst we recognize that is the challenge, but we also see and recognize that master plans are very relevant. They are very relevant because they offer that legal space for engagement and participation. They offer the constitutional right that we have for engagement in the city making process. But they are also recognizing that state-led formal planning needs to be engaged with, and the 30-20% of city population that this planning engages with at the moment needs to be broadened and expanded to the population groups that we're working with, that we are at the moment working with. So with that recognition that yes, we need to also give more power and decentralize this planning from the multiple agencies that operate in our city. So with these two, what is why is now that I come to why are we even having a discussion on this. Primarily a couple of reasons that Kirti Bhai shared very clearly, that we are on the verge of urban sort of expansion. We are definitely adding more cities. Our census is coming up, and probably in the next census we will easily have 10,000 more Indian cities. And COVID has shown us that there are glaring inequalities, and that's out in the open in front of everyone. Pollution being a very good case of Kirti Bai that Kirti Bai has just shared. I was just looking at the data when Kirti Bai said that. So of the first 20, I think 15 are Indian cities, and if you put South Asia, 19 or 18 are South Asian cities. So if we are to meet this huge challenge of number of cities, huge challenge of the issue of sustainability, I think there has to be a systemic sort of engagement with the whole process, and that is what we are aiming to address and move towards in this discussion, and also to institutionalize and better the existing framework that we have. And that can also mean not just to institutionalize the better practices or the little successes that we have had across in different cities, but also to look at what the civil society organizations and what communities require, and also to institutionalize practice of working, resisting in the urban space that we have right now. So the webinar, or the intention of this gathering, is not to just understand what's happening where, but also plan for future engagements in our cities with respect to people's engagement in master plan. And I would request everyone to kind of dwell upon that as we kind of go along. So very quickly, with that few minutes of my longish introduction, I will very quickly introduce our speakers. We have a very diverse bunch of speakers with huge amount of experience. So the collective wisdom in the room is really amazing. Firstly, I'll introduce in the order of our speaker and their presentation. Shalaka, she's a member of convener of Maybe Delhi campaign. She's a social designer and is working as a coordinator for Maybe Dilli, a people's campaign that calls for in inclusion in Delhi's master plan. And over the last couple of years, she has done fabulous work on the Delhi master plan, and it would be her presentation that kind of acts as a trigger the responses that follows. Rumi ji, Rumi Aijaz from Observer Research Foundation. He's a senior fellow in ORF, where he's responsible for the conduct of urban policy research initiative. His effort has been to build a better understanding of urban issues and produce new and correct knowledge for managing urban growth. Having done a lot of research and reports on master plans, urban planning, and participation, Rumi is um, recognized for his contribution in this field. Kaustuv from PRIA Delhi. Dr. Kaustuv Bandyopadhyay is director in PRIA, which is Participatory Research in Asia. And PRIA is a civil society organization based out of New Delhi with over 30 years of engagement with people on citizen participation, democratic governance, and civil society development. He has worked extensively with over 25 years of experience on capacity building projects and participatory learning. What PRIA brings to the table is engaging with civil societies, training and capacitating them, but also working very closely with the state. I think really happy to have Kaustuv with us. Marina, she's the program coordinator at Youth for Voluntary Action, YUVA India, based out of Bombay. She's been working on the issues of urbanization and urban poverty. And she has engaged extensively in Bombay and outside of Mumbai on the issue of master plans, and would be very interesting to hear from her of the manner in which people's engagement with city planning was carried about in Bombay. It would be great to hear from Marina on that. Dinesh ji, who's representing Gurgaon Water Forum and TRCSS JNU. He's a scientist and was a chief scientist with CSIR. Right now, he's the coordinator for South Asia Sustainability Hub and Knowledge and visiting professor in Transdisciplinary Research Cluster on Sustainability Studies in JNU. Of the many hats that he wears, he's also actively involved on the issues of urbanization, has written and worked extensively with social movements and people's movement on the issue of sustainability. He's also convener for Gurgaon Water Forum and engaged extensively with city planning processes. Great to have you here, Dinesh ji. Fabricio, who's joining us from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He's an architect and planner and PhD in urban and region planning. Is a professor at the Institute of Urban and Regional Planning Research, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He's also worked as a planner in the city hall with over 20 years of experience, and also worked with the Brazilian Ministry of Cities from 2003 to 2005, and specifically researches on extension activities on popular plans in the context of social conflict, and studies municipal urban plans and the impacts on large urban projects on Brazilian cities. And last but not the least, we have Mary, who's joined us from Manila, Philippines. She is a sociologist and is right now associated with the School of Social Sciences in Manila, and has her area of specialization as in urban poverty, community organizing, civil society, gender, and social policy, with over 40 years or 50 years of experience. So we hope that Mary would bring that and share that with us. Couple of things before we go formally into the process is that we have question and answer chat box on the bottom. So I request all our attendees and participants to please share the questions, comments, anything that you have in the question and answers. And I'll request all our panelists to address as we go along and address those chat messages if they are directed at you. And me and Ankisha will ensure that any of the important questions are taken forward and we deal with them in the second round of presentation. So firstly, I'll then request Shalaka to begin with her presentation. And Shalaka, everyone would have around 10 minutes to share their slides and presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ankisha, can you share the slides? Yeah. Hello everyone. Thank you INHAF and IGSSS for having me here today. I'm going to talk about this campaign called Maybe Dilli campaign that envisions and practices people's participation in the city planning process of Delhi. Its literal translation is I too am Delhi, because we believe Delhi is not just a space, it's not just a city or capital, it's people who build the city every day, who live in the city, provide extensively to the city's growth and economy. The campaign was started in the year 2018 with an aim of creating a united platform of civil society organizations, researchers, designers, planners, community leaders, and most importantly, Delhi residents who together can raise a collective voice of having a significant share in the upcoming Delhi master plan. And many of you might be aware that DDA, Delhi Development Authority, is currently preparing the master plan for Delhi. And this master plan is crucial because this plan will be pertinent for the next coming 20 years. So the campaign was started with some learnings and reflections from the history of the master plan, like how these previous plans of Delhi, they were not for the people, by the people and of the people because of the lack of public participation. And it is very much visible in the ground realities. Like for instance, in the name of development and beautifications, many settlements were demolished, many people were evicted, many lives and livelihoods were lost, and so on and so forth. The list is never ending. The second learning was that these three last master plans are highly complex in terms of the language. They are in English, of course, yes, but also involves technical jargon, which is a huge barrier for many. Third was that the urban poor and marginalized communities are invisible in the plan. So their needs for example, livelihoods, health, education, sanitation, they were not being taken care of. Then comes the unawareness, unawareness amongst the people, amongst the organizations. It took us time to realize how significant this master plan process is. And we should be concerned now. We are unaware of how dependent we are on it. Next slide, Ankisha. So our main aim was to engage CSOs, number one, to read and understand what is in the master plan, what's supposed to be in the master plan, how my sector, that could be anything, gender, homelessness, informal livelihoods, settlements, how they are connected with the master plan, how master plan can impact these sectors. Number two, engage people. After building a knowledge on it, how can we interact with our communities? How can we spread awareness? And also, how can we learn from the sectors we are working with? Because then only we'll be able to connect our respective sectors with the master plan. Then it's engage DDA. How can we be confident and sure that these are the gaps that we see in Delhi's plans? This is what we think DDA is missing. This is what DDA should be working on. And with this idea and vision, we formed this campaign with more than 40 organizations and independent researchers / activists. And this campaign was decided to work in 4 major segments. Research, it could be the creation of studies, knowledge products, also the timely consultations amongst the campaign members. Number 2, community engagement, for working with the residents, keeping in mind the intersectionality and diversity we have in the city. Number 3, communication, to produce informative videos, posters, fact sheets, stories, and even the word of mouth. Then it's political advocacy. We felt that there should be a solid engagement with the authority that makes the plan, that's DDA. And since this is a time they were preparing it with NIUA, that's National Institute of Urban Affairs, then NIUA has to be on board. We have to connect them with people. Next slide, Ankisha. So this is the process. I'll just share the process very briefly. The first stage is to build the united platform. Like how I mentioned, this platform has so many CSOs, researchers, leaders, but that's not something we just created overnight. We used our resources, made a very big list of experts and CSOs coming from different sectoral expertise. And for that, we identified the sectors we wanted to represent in the campaign. Then the consultations. We did a set of consultations with these organizations and try to look at each of the chapters we have in the last Delhi Master Plan document. We together identified the gaps and loopholes in the approach of DDA for almost all the essential chapters, and trust me, we are still doing that. Fact sheets. As of April 2021, we have created 20 fact sheets representing the sectors we did the consultations for. With the help of those consultations, the 4-pager fact sheet is just a way of introducing a people's perspective for the essential sectors in the master plan. And NIUA they specifically asked us to support them in the process by drafting technical reports on various themes, and that was something for us. So we presented and submitted those technical reports in NIUA, breaking the barrier that technical work can be simplified, can be understandable. Then we have public meetings. Our biggest pillar of strength is our communities and our grassroots organizations. We started with this very basic conversation on master plan. Now we have a structure, a manual to go about these meetings, but these meetings were not just for creating awareness. It was also to normalize master plan, to start a conversation on master plan, to see master plan as an integral part of our daily life. Then we have public consultations. Many times we were supporting DD and NIUA in organizing, designing, facilitating the public consultations. And when we were not doing that, when we were not part of those consultations, then we were just mobilizing the communities, assisting them in connecting with officials, reading out the fact sheets and demands again and again. And now we are in 2021, hoping to take our work and cause forward. Take people in confidence, yes, to make DD accountable and answerable to people's needs and aspirations, and to strengthen the CSOs and our campaign. Next slide. So our achievements could be the Lieutenant Governor of Delhi announcing that master plan is going to be readable, understandable, and it's going to have illustrations in it apparently. Our achievement could be very small, having a larger impact. For instance, I remember DDA was organizing this online consultation for which they invited people, and it was supposed to be via some unknown video call platform. We pressurized and asked them to switch to Zoom, which people in the communities are highly comfortable with. And they did that. And many of the communities were able to join and raise their voices and demands. And this actually did not require any major effort. It was just a small letter giving the valid reasons. The achievement could also be the youth leaders in the communities making their own local maps, highlighting their aspirations from the city, and DD Planning Commissioner herself visiting and listening to the youth leaders' demands. This is actually, I feel, a very good example of how people can be the co-creators in the planning process. Then we also had certain constraints that we faced. Our sectoral reports were very heavy initially, but then we transformed them into interactive 4-pager fact sheets. Our workshops were very dull initially. Now we have illustrations, comics, easy language to understand the master plan. Now we have tools and games to understand them better. Next slide, Ankisha. So our recent study shows that 80%, it's a study by IGSSS and Maybe Dilli campaign. It shows that 80% of the Delhi residents are uninformed about the master plan. They have not heard about the master plan. And none of the respondents has read the document or know how to read and understand the land use maps. They have no clue who's making the master plan or where should we go to read it. Now the efforts from DDA's side would be seen once the draft plan is out, but our campaign needs to strategize before that, and we know that. So we as a campaign are trying our best to reach out to people, to strengthen the work that we have been doing. I think today it will be very helpful to hear from the panelists about their experiences from their cities and what Delhi can learn from them, what maybe Delhi can learn from them. So yeah, thank you, and over to you, Aravind.
Thank you for sharing the interesting work that you're doing, Shalaka, as part of the Maybe Dilli campaign, of which we are also part of. Not asking questions right now, but something that we can think about when you, let's say, come for the second round is that Delhi has this advantage of being a very big city with a lot of civil society organizations and with prior experience of engaging in urban planning or master plan experiences, right? So, how much of the engagement do you think would be kind of would have happened because we were located in Delhi, and how much do you think we as you as maybe Delhi campaign have managed to engage with DDA, and if given a chance, what would be the other possible ways that you would engage? That's probably something that we can discuss in the second round, and you can share your reflection on that. So now I will request Rumi, Aijaz to share the frameworks of what are the different agencies, what are the levels of different forms of urban planning that's underway in our cities, and what do you think is the framework for us to engage and take it forward. So over to you, Rumi.
Hello, is the presentation visible?
Yes.
Okay, and my voice is okay? Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I'm honored to be a part of this program. I would like to thank Aravind for the kind introduction, and my greetings to the distinguished speakers and participants of this webinar. Mr. Shah has very nicely, aptly drawn India's urban landscape, which makes it easy for me to take the discussion forward. And Aravind has also given a very good overview of the institutional arrangements and the planning practices that are being followed in the country. I would continue with the discussion that has been put forward by the previous speaker. Through my presentation, I will describe how people are supposed to be involved in India's urban and regional planning exercises. The presentation begins with an introduction, and this is followed by 3 case studies on which basically try and explain how the citizens are being engaged in the planning process. And the concluding section offers some ideas for facilitating greater people's participation. As has already been mentioned, and I would like to re-emphasize that in India, lack of people's participation in city planning and development is an important reason for social and economic deprivation of a large population, but other factors are equally responsible for the problems we see in today's urban centers of India, such as, and by other factors, I mean the ability of planning and development agencies to prepare the plans, their implementation, strategies and projects, their ability to generate funds, record and maintain data, their ability or their provisions for reservation of land and spaces for the urban poor, for their housing, for enabling them to conduct their informal activities such as street vending, etc. A combination of problems or factors are responsible for the present deprivation that we see today in India's urban sectors. And of course, lack of people's participation is an important reason. With respect to people's participation, I would say that the government agencies in cities in Indian cities, they recognize the significance of inclusive planning, and steps have been taken in this regard. This is observed from the legislation of the planning agencies as well as the city development plans, which mandate conduct of civic surveys and people's participation. For instance, people are supposed to be involved. They should be involved in the pre-planning stage, according to what these policy documents mention, that people should be involved in the pre-planning stage, that is in decision-making, in the development of the city's vision, and in the identification of needs, their needs. Also, they should be involved in the post-planning stage, that is before plan finalization and implementation of development programs and projects. Also, they are expected to play a role in the implementation and evaluation of development projects, and also in formulation of a grievance and redress system. Now, this is what the laws and development plans have provided for. How much is being followed, and what is the current impact of those provisions that have been provided in these policy documents has been slightly indicated by the previous speaker. The generally used mechanisms and avenues for people's participation in India are interactive meetings, focused group discussions, workshops, site walks or visits, demonstration of ideas. For example, there is a certain solution that might work for the communities living in different parts of the city. So some kind of a idea is developed, and that is demonstrated in front of the public to understand how much it would work for them. And also there has been a practice of participatory mapping in some states or Indian cities. Nowadays, we are also seeing the utilization of new modes of obtaining quick feedback from the public, such as use of e-platforms and crowdsourcing service, which is basically the opinions are obtained from a large population via online sources like internet, social media, smartphone apps, etc. The case of Delhi has just been discussed, and this slide, you can see that it shows the planning process followed in the case of Delhi. It has three important components. The first one is plan preparation, the second one is plan implementation, and the third one is plan monitoring and review. So according to the master plan for Delhi for the year 2021, this is how it was formulated and put in shape. The inputs were collected from several citizens residing in the city, and these included the citizens, the representatives of various resident welfare associations, and the elected municipal functionaries or the councillors who work in urban governments, because they are also a part of citizens, as they are representatives of citizens in the local government. So, but before approval of the plan by the urban ministry or the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, the draft plan was notified for inviting public objections and suggestions through gazette notification and public notice in newspapers. It is learned from these government documents that about 7,000 opinions were received, which were considered by the Board of Inquiry, which met on about 17 occasions to take a decision on what needs to be done insofar as the responses that have been received. Now, a similar process, now Delhi's next master plan is due for notification. It is under preparation. It is for the period 2021 to 2041, and it is quite expected that a similar process would be followed in finalization of Delhi's next master plan. Presently, from what we learned about the work that is going on, consultations are being organized with a range of stakeholders who are discussing things with the public on a wide range of topics. And the target group that is mentioned are representatives of civil society organizations, the industrialists, professional associations, differently abled persons, slum dwellers and residents of unauthorized colonies, the market and trader associations, youths and villagers. In addition to this, an interactive microsite is also available on the website of DDA. A link is provided there, which is basically a citizen engagement portal for MPD 2041, which has been created to encourage greater public participation in plan preparation. My next example of public participation in the planning process is the Smart City proposal or plan for Delhi. As you know, India has a smart cities mission, which has been launched after the current government came into power in 2014. So the mission was launched after 1 year, 2015. 100 cities have been selected to be developed as smart cities. Most of these, 99% of these are existing cities. Here you can see on this slide that on the left side of this slide is the map of National Capital Territory of Delhi. And in between, and as you know, as many people know, that Delhi is being governed by 4 governments, local governments, 3 municipal corporations of Delhi, the New Delhi Municipal Council and the Delhi Cantonment Board. So you can see the purple color in the left-hand side map. That is the area governed by the New Delhi Municipal Council. And from within that area, which is about 44 square kilometers, about 2.2 square kilometer area has been selected for converting or for functioning as a smart city, wherein I recently wrote a paper about the projects that have been implemented or are being implemented within this smart city area identified in the New Delhi Municipal Council area. And here, again, a participatory approach according to the smart city proposal or plan for Delhi. A participatory approach was followed, which meant that a target group was identified. It included the economically weaker sections of the society, the slum dwellers, women, the representatives from resident welfare associations and students. And the common citizen engagement methods that were used were street plays, documentaries, presentations, march by students to generate awareness, information on the website, like Government of India had put information about the smart city work underway in Delhi on this website, on their website, and pamphlets were distributed. And there was also extensive coverage in print media. In addition to this, according to the plan or the proposal of the smart city for Delhi, face-to-face interactions were organized, online, offline interactions were organized, and competitions on a range of topics such as essays and ideas on how can what model of smart parking would work best. And idea camps were opened and run to gather opinions from interested individual citizens and all other stakeholders. The third example that I would like to give, since I have a background in regional planning, I also follow the practices that are being followed in India for preparation of regional plan. So very recently, some time back, I learned about the approach that is being followed for the state of Goa. As you can see on the map shows the map of India and the state of Goa. Goa is on the western coast of India, the circle that you can see, and on the left-hand side you can see the map of the state of Goa. It shows the physiographic divisions of Goa. Since Goa has been identified as it's a part of the ecosystem of the Western Ghat hill ranges and is considered a biodiversity hotspot. And the aim that was kept while preparing the regional plan for Goa was to protect Goa's endangered and fragile ecosystem. So in Goa, what they did was that in the regional plan for 2021, one can learn many lessons which can be related to how the experiences of Indian cities are working, or some important lessons can be drawn, because Goa is often referred to as a good case where participatory experience has worked and has contributed to addressing the needs and requirements of the ecosystem of Goa, and also the communities that are living in the interior areas and in the villages. So Delhi, for example, also has the Aravalli Hill range, which is a restricted zone, which does not allow, government does not allow any unauthorized construction to come in there. And also Delhi, as some portion of Delhi's population lives in rural areas. So it is a mix. It's a diverse place where one can find a different landscape and communities living in different ways. So in Goa, a state level committee was prepared. Since the entire process was institutionalized, the state level committee was constituted to oversee the process of public participation. And then below this, a sub-regional committee was constituted for several matters, for displaying plan at the local level, putting it up in front of the public in various ways. They distributed participatory process kits to public, which included the plans at the regional level and at the local level. They distributed notes, questionnaires in local language, meeting schedule, etc. They explained about the meetings that would be arranged and how the public would participate in these meetings. And in this process, the views were collected and they were classified. They were classified by the sub-regional committee and submitted to the higher level committee, that is the state level committee. So my idea of bringing in this Goa experience was to make the point that they have institutionalized the system, and which seems to be lacking in the case of many Indian cities, where they just put the information on the website, or they assign the work, like Ms. Shalaka mentioned about assigning the work to a autonomous organization such as the NIUA, about just go ahead and conduct these consultations with diverse range of stakeholders. And there is no transparency in how things are being done, what kind of inputs are being generated, where do things stand, what are people who are living in the uninhabitable areas of the cities, what are they saying, and how much of that would be addressed, because that's also a major issue with the urban planning community always points out, that once the opinions are collected, then no proper action is taken to address some of the most significant of those opinions. So to conclude, the participatory process needs to be handled effectively. It is necessary to have an administrative setup comprising a coordination committee and lower level committees. I do not think it exists in the case of Delhi, which I've been following for some time. The second conclusion is that many agencies and departments and non-governmental organizations and the media can play an active role in assimilating people's inputs. So this has to be, this aspect has to be explored by the plan preparing agencies. The third conclusion is that the inputs need to be analyzed. You know, it has to be done properly. It has to be done properly in a systematic manner. And those that are of greater public interest should be incorporated at the time of finalizing the plan. And finally, some facilitation centers should be set up at public places in the city, like Delhi has established public amenities centers in different places in the New Delhi area, which is one project under the Smart Cities mission, which provides 4 or 5 services like a digital clinic or a ATM or water ATM, etc. So similar facility for facilitating interaction between the citizen and the government about the use of land use, about their grievances, and a link to the master plan website or the microsite that has been created. Some kind of an integrated approach needs to be adopted to properly address the full range of issues that exist in urban areas of India. Thank you very much, and extremely sorry for the extended time.
Yes, thank you, Rumi, for concluding and sharing your perspective on planning. So there are a lot of questions that you would have, and I'll request you to kind of address them as we kind of move on to the next speaker. But very quickly, it's also for us to then think that are we limiting our engagement and also supporting people's engagement and viewing people's engagement in the whole master planning process from the lens of what the state creates or the spaces that the state is offering? How do we think of new subversive ways of having these engagements? Maybe Rumiji, when you kind of come back, we'll be able to talk more about that, because we experience that even in the interactions that we kind of facilitated also, there were instances of communities not even having enough data package, so to say. Simple things like access to cell phone, access to data to participate in the Zoom meetings that were called by DDA. So how to view even the act of participation in a more sort of political sense? So those were the couple of questions that I had, and a lot of questions that are there in the question and answer box for you. So I'll request you to kind of respond to all of those. I'll request now Kaustuv to take over and request you to again stick to the 10 minutes that we have. Kaustuv, over to you.
Thanks, Aravind. Thank you very much to INHAF and IGSSS for inviting me and giving this opportunity to talk to all of you. This is the second opportunity to participate in the INHAF series of webinar. In one of the earlier webinars, we dealt with this particular issue of citizen participation, not only in city planning, but also in the city governance. So I've been thinking that what can be shared to this audience from our own experience in this particular webinar. So what I'm going to do is to talk about 3 things. One is a few dilemmas in designing a citizen participation in the city planning process. And then second, I'll bring some of our own experiences of facilitating citizen participation in some kind of city planning process, whether it is a development plan or zonal plan, or city development plan, or sectoral solid waste management, citywide planning, even ward level planning. And out of all these engagements and trying out various forms of citizen participation, I would sort of bring a couple of learning which could be useful for today's discussion. So before I do that, let me start with these questions that, how do we understand the contradictions in the 21st century citizens? So we need to sort of, break down the concept of citizen and concepts of citizenship. Now, on one hand, you'd see, citizens are great inventors of public problem. When they confront a problem, they will find the solutions. But at the same time, citizens are also extremely distrustful of the public officials who are supposed to be the official problem solvers. The second kind of contradiction is where we see these days a super collectivism from the living rooms, whereas we also see an apathy in the public life or participating in the public life. There is connectedness through social networks, and all these social media platforms have given enormous opportunities to the citizens to connect to each other. And many a times, one can say that they are great opinion makers. But at the same time, all these citizens are also lonely in private lives. If you look at the participation through social media or other online processes, generally speaking, we are pretty much civil in our private life. We don't engage in uncivility in the private life, but you can also see the tremendous amount of incivility in the public appearance, whether it is through social media, online platforms, or even a town hall meeting. So how do you understand all of these? Now, since we are talking about citizen participation in the context of master plan, and I'm sort of intrigued by the question that if master plan or these long-term perspective plans are valid for 20 years, 25 years, even some of the city development planning processes were sort of for the duration of 5 years. So what does it mean? Basically it means if we restrict the participation in the master plan or the understanding and practice of participation in the master plan or other city planning process, are we going to restrict it for once in a lifetime opportunity? But then what about the active citizenship in everyday city government? So what kind of processes can be designed which would allow citizens to understand the city from their own perspective and then engage with the fellow citizens as well as with government and other actors. The last point in this slide is that who participates and who do not participate. We have to think about this question, and from our perspective, whose participation is critical in terms of all the things that Kirtibhai has mentioned in his introductory remark, that in order to make a city much more equal, much more equitable, much more inclusive and participatory, we have to ask the question that whose participation is critical. Then we also need to understand that how do we understand citizen participation and its various forms. I mean, the practitioners and the academicians, and they have tried to categorize different forms of participation, but in a kind of layman speaking, citizen participation is an umbrella term, and it describes activities by which people's concerns, needs, interests, and values are incorporated into the decisions and actions of the public matters and issues. So here the emphasis on the participation in the decision making and the action, participatory action, which matters to people's lives. For almost like 30 years, 40 years, it's not that people are not participating. People are participating in a kind of conventional manner, and it's an older form of engagement. But when it is moderated by, controlled by the state agencies, whether it is municipal corporation or whether it's the state government or various examples that previous speakers have given. A large part of such participation has been a kind of conventional participation, which sort of in a way uphold the order. So it's a kind of regimented participation, and at its best, it shows some kind of downward vertical accountability and transparency, but not necessarily provides an opportunity for the citizens to talk to each other and to come up with solutions in a kind of collective manner. So a typical example of this conventional participation would be like town hall meetings. Then you see Rumi has been talking about smart city participation in the smart city proposals. So here, at base, in most out of this 100 city planning process, most of the planning and participation in the planning process was, I would call them, it's called team participation, where people as an individual, they contributed ideas, sometimes signing petitions, sometimes filling out surveys, or sometimes giving opinion on social media, or a typical platform which has been offered by mygov.in. So those are mechanisms for participation. But perhaps what we are not talking about, and perhaps Shalaka in her presentation has sort of touched upon this point of peak participation, that it's not an event-oriented participation, but it is a process-oriented participation, where large number of people working in small groups participate. And this participation process becomes a learning process, decision-making process, and an agreement to act on the current situation. So in designing a citizen participation in any kind of planning process, let us be careful and be mindful that what kind of participation we are trying to promote. And perhaps in a kind of more pragmatic way, we have to make use of all these forms of participation in the right kind of balance, but without sort of seeing participation as a learning process for the citizens, perhaps we won't be able to make the kind of social transformation that is required to address the current sort of inequalities exist in the city. So I thought that I'll sort of bring. I know that there is a time constraint, but from our own experience, we have facilitated a preparation of city development plans in 2 cities a couple of years ago, in Chapra in Bihar and Dumka in Jharkhand state. Now, what was emphasized in this process is precisely that participation is an educational process, participation is a learning process. And therefore, when there is no practice of participation, even if you ask or invite people to participate, even if you provide a platform to participate, a space for participation, you don't get the results that you might have expected. And therefore, the importance of building an enabling environment for the citizens and other stakeholders is extremely important. So from our own experience, what we have tried to do is to start with a massive number of informal consultations across citizens and stakeholders to understand the issues in the city. And by the way, we chose to do a city development planning because of, which was coming out of our own frustration to see during the chain environment process, where fly-by night consultants were hired by the Ministry of Urban Development, and they were dumped to the cities, and they were asked to prepare the city development plan. And they had absolutely no clue about the city. They had absolutely no understanding about the city. Even the municipal corporations or municipal councils who were supposed to be at the driving seat of this city development planning process, they were completely unaware about what is a city development plan, what are the processes, and so on and so forth. So we got frustrated with these city development planning processes, and therefore we started thinking about to design a process which could rectify, or at least provide a basis to say that how a city development planning can be done in a more participatory manner. So the second thing that we did was to build capacities of the elected officials, elected councillors, and the municipal officials, because they are ultimately, at the end of the day, they will be managing the cities, and their involvement and understanding was critical. Then we also worked with the local civil society organizations as partners, because many of you might agree that while Indian civil society organizations have been quite vibrant in the rural areas, that vibrancy is missing mostly in the urban areas, and therefore many a times there is a kind of ideological positioning even from the civil society organizations, and there is an unawareness and therefore refusing to accept the growing urbanization in the cities. So we had to work with local civil society organizations, build their perspective, and convince them that why it is important to work on the urban issues, and therefore the issues around the urbanization of poverty. So all these, in a way, was geared towards build capacities in multiple stakeholders. Then what we did, like massive citywide public awareness, and as I have been emphasizing the point that we took this planning process as an opportunity for civic education, an opportunity for citizen education, with a special focus on the informal settlements. But we also realized that in a city politics context, working alone with the informal settlements might not work, and therefore we had to work with the middle class and other stakeholders in the city in order to sensitize them on the issues related to informal settlements. And then there was a kind of series of formal consultations at the zonal level, cluster of wards, at the local ward level, and then special consultation in the informal settlements. But within the informal settlements and the wards, we also worked with a number of other social groups. So there was sort of consultations for women, consultations with the children. There was also consultation with the people with disability. So in a way, there was a kind of normative framework for inclusion, and then asking them that how they want to develop this plan for their own city. And this series of identification interaction with the stakeholders followed the process. And it took almost like first 5-6 months to have this consultative process. So then came the question of data collection, collation, and analysis. But we didn't follow a kind of neatly designed process, because in the participatory research we started with some questionnaire-based study, which sort of we felt that these issues are important, which we learned from the earlier informal consultations and also the formal consultations. The knowledge that we gathered, that was shared with the community, and in many communities, we have consulted that what kind of questions can be asked. Even the questionnaire was prepared in a participatory fashion. Then, although we sort of used the Google Map to see the entire city, but even mapping at the local level and the ground verification and all those things happen in partnership with the citizens and other stakeholders. And as the data was collected in a participatory format and participatory methods, we didn't wait that all these things will be shared at the end of the process. We didn't wait for that. As the data was collected, it was analyzed, and the initial results were again shared with the community. So as to get validation from the community and other stakeholders that these are the kind of analysis emerging from the exercise. And then we started the planning preparation process with a visioning process, and in small stakeholder groups. It was then consolidated in one place that these are the kind of diverging and converging views in terms of how they look at the city. And then towards the end, we sort of we brought all the stakeholders together, and there was a series of multi-stakeholder dialogues across the cities in terms of thinking about the vision of the city. And then towards the end of this process, then we started identification and elaboration of projects based on the critical priority sectors and themes talked about by different social groups in the city. Along with that, we also helped municipality to prepare a city investment plan, and kind of resources that city might require in order to implement this plan, and the possible sources from where this investment can be made. Because one of the difficulties with any citywide planning is that in the absence of an investment plan, there is impractical suggestions incorporated in the plan, and then it is never sort of realized and implemented by the municipality. So what has happened as a process that the officials in the municipality and the elected representatives and councillors in the city, they own the process, but at the same time, the citizens and their various groups also started owning the process. It was not a perfect process, but at least a series of steps that we sort of facilitated with the community and with other stakeholders, including the municipality. That was an empowering experience. I just sort of skip these, but some of the key lessons that sort of high-level lessons, if you like. One is that information in a format. My previous speakers have really underlined this point, that information in a format, in a language which is understandable by the common people is key to facilitate participation or enabling an environment for participation. That awareness, but what we also emphasize is not an individualized participation, but an organized participation of the citizens. And therefore, working with the informal settlers, different occupation groups, different interest groups is critical in the planning process. Second is that you have an output, desired output from the plan as a kind of in the form of a plan. But the planning process should be an opportunity for the citizenship education, and it's an investment. And then if you participate in a 20-year planning process, it makes sense because the learning and the education and the information that they receive, if that becomes empowering, there is high likelihood that this participation would continue. The third is the process should be able to give voices to the most marginalized, and they must have an alternative choices and a bit of control over their own lives and development. My last point is that, and in the previous webinar, we have dealt with this issue of institutional space. I think Rumi talked about the 74th constitutional amendment, which utterly failed in provide an institutionalized ward committee and other space. There was community participation law, which have utterly failed to provide a kind of institutional space to citizen participation. And even if in certain locations, in certain states, in certain cities, these institutionalized space have provided opportunity for citizen participation. But my last question, remember, whose participation is critical becomes all the more important, because most of the time it is the informal people who are living in the informal settlements and the most marginalized, which didn't get the opportunity to participate. And therefore, along with that universalized, institutional spaces for participation, you also need particularized spaces for participation, which would allow the most marginalized group to participate. So let me stop here, and perhaps, during the second round and in the question answer, I'll bring some more information. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Kaustuv, for the very interesting points that you've mentioned of how participation is not just event to event kind of a engagement, but more of has to be a more continuous and a long-term one. So I think there are a lot of questions that we have in the question and answer box. I will request everyone to kind of start
Ankita,
Yes, sir.
what is happening?
Let me check. It seems Arnav has Aravind has got disconnected. He's not here. One second.
Who?
Aravind. Marina, you can start. I guess it's your.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Why don't you start, huh?
Anshika, will you share your screen with the PPT I had shared?
Yeah, let me.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Thank you, INHAF IGSS, for this invite, and the speakers before me have made some very interesting points. Also, I think the discussion in the comments and chat box is also fairly interesting. So I don't know if my presentation is going to do justice to that discussion, but these are actually more than just me speaking about our experience of the Mumbai Development Plan campaign. I will try and just give a brief context to where we locate, practice within planning in the Indian context. I'll then move on to give a few takeaways from our learning based on our work on people's participation planning in different contexts, and then just some of my reflections. I'm not really going to be talking about the outcomes or achievements, but just some reflections on planning and what the possibilities of planning are, if at all there are any. Okay, Anshika, you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so in terms of the context, of course, in the Indian context specifically, one sees the use of land outside the demarcation of the master plan development plan as a very common feature. Whether it is land used for housing, land used to work, for social amenities, services, recreation, open spaces, all of that is developing organically as a result of people's needs. Whether it is settlements you see, markets you see, they grow, they thrive, they sort of formalize themselves over a period of time, and they maybe typically do not follow planning visions, they do not follow urban plans, they are not following development control regulations. And this is true for both greenfield cities in India, whether you see planned cities like Navi Mumbai, Bhubaneswar, Chandigarh, or even brownfield cities, large cities like Mumbai, Delhi, smaller cities like Indore, Guwahati, Ranchi, etc. So this is a marker of planning and the reality of the Indian city. And of course, contemporary planning discourse has increasingly focused on having to understand this. And it's termed as the informality of land use. When this is a major way in which land is used, yet it is termed informality from a more formal planning perspective. And what technocratic master planning ends up doing is to sort of try and create some sort of an order in this chaos or informality. But what master planning ends up doing, urban planning ends up doing, is it ends up creating much more chaos in the lives of people who actually live and work in these spaces. And I think forced evictions of houses, forced evictions of livelihood spaces are a very clear example of how this order and chaos is sort of dealt with via planning. And of course, there is this dissonance that one can say exists within planning in the Indian context, and it's attributed to the fact that there is an exclusive elitist vision of the city, and that vision does not take into consideration the needs of the majority, the working needs, their living needs. The majority, largely, of course, not just the urban poor, but also of a large middle class, one can say. So here you have that plans exist. They exist in most cities, but they do not respond to the everyday. But what needs to change in this current context is sort of being demonstrated by practice. And of course, there are few examples of what is being done. You know, Shalaka shared in Delhi. The earlier speakers, Rumi and Kaustuv also shared about what is being done. But there is something to learn from these everyday examples. And not to say that planning is the solution to every urban problem, but it does have the potential to be part of this solution. It may be one of the many tools that can be used to sort of look at how our cities can be made more equitable. But planning is showing that there are new ways of planning within cities. Practice is showing that, practice is showing that there are new ways of planning within cities. There is new ways of thinking about how land is used, how urban plans can be made. And this comes effectively from people themselves. But this needs to be recognized. It's one thing to say, yes, this is happening, but are you being able to then recognize this in the formal planning practice? You can go to the next slide. So through some examples in practice, I will talk about how, why planning is crucial, why planning, especially at the local level, becomes so crucial. And these are incremental changes in planning practice. They are not, one-time changes, or it needs to, you need to keep doing the same thing. You need to be consistent with this, and only then can you really say that, okay, something is changing with regards to urban planning. In terms of our work that YUVA and other organizations had done on the Mumbai Development Plan, the 30-year development plan, the 2014 to 34 development plan. So an important campaign was organized, much like the Maybe Dilli Abhiyan and other campaigns that have been organized on planning practices in the city. And a few outcomes that I'm just going to share with some examples. One is that through this participatory process, because it involved bringing together diverse actors across the city, largely from marginalized groups as well, what ended up happening was people are able to build an understanding of the city as a whole, which often is not the case, because people are very often restricted to just thinking my community, my garden, my school, my market. I need that to change. It needs to be better. But somehow, when you engage in campaigns that look at city planning, there is an understanding of the city of a whole that is built, and this collectivizing that begins to take place around spatial concerns. Just building spatial understanding of communities is so important, because especially for the marginalized, one is they are not allowed to stake a claim for themselves in the city. And building a collective of people, whether it's the residents of informal settlements, of urban villages, fishing villages, etc., these collectives are able to give them collective bargaining power with planning authorities, with the local government, and enable some process of reclamation. Maybe the outcome hasn't been what the campaign set out to do, but even that process is just as powerful and just as important in the larger context of how can cities be reclaimed, how can they become more equitable to those who occupy them. So, I mean, if you just take the example of, say, what happened to the slum settlements in Mumbai, initially, you know, they were not marked. They were marked just as residential, just marked as resident with, you know, the residential. The reservation, sorry, they were marked with residential reservations, and you know, you had maybe Ambani's tower that is also marked with a residential reservation, when the context and the realities of these two kind of settlements are vastly different. So there was a big push that the campaign made saying reserve these settlements as slums, and of course that didn't happen finally as a reservation, because we were told that slums are not a reservation in planning. But what happened in the existing land use plan is that slum settlements were marked. Of course, they were just marked with boundaries. There were many hits, many misses there. But that was something that was done also because of a lot of activism and action through multiple actors in the campaign. Similarly, the case with the fishing community, urban villages, they were able to negotiate, ensure that their settlements are marked, their markets are marked, their livelihood areas are marked. And this is actually quite important. I mean, take for example, even the homeless shelters in Mumbai. The homeless, one can say, are the most deprived group in a city. You know, they have no claim whatsoever to even an inch of land that the city has to offer. But just the fact that the homeless and groups working with the homeless were able to reserve land for homeless shelters in the city that had traditionally never, it had historically never happened, itself is a very important outcome. So one to just say that making these collectives, ensuring that there is some collective bargaining power, they are able to think just more than their settlements, but part of a larger network, part of a city level engagement process itself is extremely powerful in itself. But of course, this can take place through constant planning education. And similar to what Kaustuv was saying earlier, that planning education is actually key to this process. Nothing can happen without it. And by that, we mean actually demystifying these plans. Even Shalaka's presentation spoke about it, Rumiji's presentation spoke about it, talking about how one needs to break that barrier that the plan is going to be in the office of the planning authority. How do you take maps to people? How do you explain over months, you know, how plans are changing, what an existing land use plan is, what the draft development plan is, what the final development plan is, what DCRs are. All of that is actually years of work that, you know, we were able to do at, through that, of course, these collective mobilization was able to take place. Another thing that happened was that people are able to take informed decisions about their life in the city. So for example, just creating barefoot planners who are active participants in understanding, negotiating with their city, they are able to take these decisions. Even for example, this work that IHS and YUVA had done in Indore, where we looked at how are slums provision, slums or, you know, people built housing, how are they provisioned in the city's master plan, given the fact that they were rapidly being displaced under a housing scheme, under various urban schemes that are there. And what ended up happening was that alongside this capacity building of people who were likely to get displaced, they also trained in spatial thinking, planning their city, making decisions on housing, because otherwise they are left decisionless. It's someone else's decision what kind of housing you go through. But through planning education, people can actually make choices that no, we don't want to go into vertical housing. We would rather just have this land reserve. We would, you know, we would prefer that incremental housing is the way we want to go ahead. So some of those decisions are also very crucial. Another very key aspect is that planning standards, whether it is the development control regulations or you know, planning norms that exist, people through education and through these collectives develop their own alternatives. There were many examples that we saw in Mumbai of people developing their own plans, of course, with the support of technical experts, whether it was the Malwani people's plan that was developed or the Cheetah Camp people's plan that was developed. These are all, you know, a lot of street vendors markets that were designed. These alternatives that people themselves are able to create challenge these planning standards that are sort of imposed on local areas, and that itself is a way in which it's, I would say, maybe an entry point for a lot of significant outcomes through formal participation. So if this is what people are doing when participation is not formalized, one can only think of what people will be able to do and contribute to planning their cities if participation is formalized, not just consultative participation, but actual process-led participation, meaningful participation. So, and I mean, that's just another, another learning or takeaway. Of course, constant engagement with planning authorities is needed because, another speaker before me was talking about confrontation. Very often it is seen that, oh, these people are here to confront what we are trying to do. We are only here with all our best intentions. We have the technical knowledge. But there is then that confrontation is a byproduct if there is going to be participation in planning, because planning is political at the end of the day. It has a lot to do with who gets what share of land, which share of the city. So that, how do you then engage with confrontation, engage with authorities? There are power dynamics, there are class dynamics at play over there. So that is also something that one needs to be a little cognizant. When you say participation, people's participation, it is actually extremely messy and beyond the scope of most planners who have to be the face of the state at that point of time. So, I don't have an answer there. That engagement needs to happen. People need to be made aware. And I think, of course, planning education can also start addressing this question if they are really talking about ensuring participation in planning. But of course, how much can plans really do? And, one needs to understand there are limitations of planning, of course, but just a few reflections of how planning can become responsive that I have. You can go to the next slide. One is that, like I mentioned in the context, is that citizens are planning the city irrespective of a plan being there or not. And that needs to be acknowledged, that people themselves are planners. They are creating space for themselves. They create workspace, they create living spaces for themselves. It needs to be understood not as aberration, but that they are planning for their needs. That a slum is not an aberration to a plan, it is a solution to a problem that exists in the city. And local area plans, actually planning at the local level, not at the city level, is actually crucial to ensuring this gets done. Because if you're sitting planning for an enormous city like Delhi and Bombay and trying to make plans for informal settlements, it is not going to happen. But it is only at the local level, at the ward level, at the at the small the local area level, which is a sub part of the ward, is that can planning actually be acknowledged, citizens contribution in planning can be acknowledged, and the plan can be made better. It's not to make it worse. No one wants to live in a more terrible condition. Everyone, of course, wants it to be more inclusive, done so that their rights are so that their rights are acknowledged, etc. Having said that, participation in planning can be tokenistic. We've heard that earlier from the speakers as well. But unless process in a processual way, planning is acknowledged as a right, it is only then that the marginalized in the city who are far removed from mainstream processes of decision making can actually be able to, imagine the city that they live in, that they can plan the city that they live in. And I mean, I don't know how to say this without sounding, like this is being repeated too much, but it is a right. How does that right get institutionalized? It cannot be a 30-day window period. It cannot be, send an email. This is something that a conversation needs to be had if we actually talk about people's planning as a right and really find what that means. Another part is, planning cannot of course be seen as a standalone. It's part of a larger urbanization, one of the many tools of urbanization, you can say. But governance is a significant part of it. So whether it is to institutionalize participatory processes or whether it is a part of implementation of the actual plan, governance is key. So to keep focusing on planning is also limited in a sense. And I mean, one is, of course, if you look at the 74th Amendment Act, and you look at state planning acts, like, for example, the Maharashtra Regional and Town Planning Act clearly says that it recognizes people's participation through, fixed days after certain processes, etc. But unless you have a governance structure at the local level that is able to facilitate that participation, it just remains on paper. Similarly, the 74th Amendment Act that says planning needs to be done at the local level. But do we have governance structures that even allow this form of participation to happen is something very crucial. I mean, just another example from our work in Mumbai. So, I mentioned that I know Aravind is on this, and Aravind was a big part of this work on the homeless shelters and ensuring homeless shelters are reserved on the development plan. Like I mentioned, they were never reserved in the plan before, and homelessness in Mumbai is a big problem. So ultimately from I think 2013 and maybe 2017, a lot of people there was a lot of focus on ensuring that homeless shelters were reserved. And in 2016 finally there were 78 shelters that were reserved in the Mumbai development plan, which was a huge achievement of the campaign and for the homeless in the city. But it took 5 years for not just 5 years of the campaign. It also took many years of a lot of activism to ensure that that reservation was made in the city. But 5 years later, in 2021, of course, those reservations have been made. In some places, the local government has been able to either build those shelters, or they've ensured that within existing social amenities, those shelters are there, but they are not functional. So here you have 5 years of work to ensure that the shelters are reserved on a plan, and you have another 5 years of intense work to ensure that these shelters are even functional. Because this is, of course, the plan did what it had to, and that's a big part of what planning could do. But if you have a governance system that is still so unresponsive to the most deprived in the city, one cannot just say that planning is the most important part of ensuring that urbanization can be more equitable. So that's just one example there. Just I mean, taking from that example, clearly planning has a social obligation. It if one thing characterizes Indian cities today, it is inequality. It is a marker of what an Indian city is. And if planning has to even respond to that inequality, can even help reduce this inequality, it needs to realize it has a social obligation. Not a technical obligation. It is not a checklist on the smart city plans. It is not a checklist on some government website that needs to be made. It actually has a huge social obligation. It needs to be based on certain values of equality, equity, justice. Because what will end up happening, and what is happening, is that planning just reproduces existing social and historic disparities in the city. So just I think realizing that, ensuring that planning involves itself in social political realities of different kinds of actors, it will actually meet some social obligations that it should have. Having said that, planning is political. Planning is not about AutoCAD GIS maps. It is about how much land is given to whom and how much power they have ultimately. So to be able to incorporate the needs of various actors, if a person who's homeless or a person who lives in a deprived informal settlement is negotiating with the local government for land for their house, versus the most powerful builder in the city negotiating for land to be reserved for his upcoming real estate project, one needs to see the politics over there. It's not a technical planning, is not a technical exercise. Of course it might be reduced to that, but uh, just I think urban planning really needs to address these differences more successfully. It needs to understand that in a lot more detail, because I think what ends up happening is planners see their work as being extremely technical, while practitioners understand the everyday political dynamics of what planning actually is, what it does to people on the ground, what marginalization it causes, etc., etc. Having said that, of course, planning is meant to exclude. I mean, it should, planning is meant to include, but what it ends up doing is it ends up excluding. And while planning is a futuristic exercise, no one knows what the future holds. One is makes a plan to supposedly make the city better, make life for residents of the city better. But no one has even seen the future. No one knew the pandemic would hit. No one knows what climate change might have for in the future. But one thing people do know is people need to be able to live sustainably in the city. By that you mean they need to have housing that is sustainable. They need to have places where they can work. They need to have places where they can just have recreation facilities. It's just the bare minimum that if planning can do, planning will actually be able to respond to the bare minimum that cities need at the moment, because frankly, none of us have seen the future, but it is something that one needs to consider, that we need to look at planning as a futuristic exercise, but a futuristic exercise for everyone, not just for the select few in the city. Anyway, sorry, I didn't realize if I hadn't asked you to change the slide. I'm so sorry. But anyway, just a
Perfect.
few of the 1 minute, Arvind. I'm doing one thing. I'm sharing the links to some of our reports that we have done with academic partners in the chat box. So, you're free to look at them. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Marina. I will straight away request, I think Dinesh is not spoken or presented. I will request Dinesh to come and yeah. And also, Dinesh, like participation right now is limited to the arena that the state is setting. So how do you think we can also kind of go beyond? There are a lot of questions that are there in the Q&A box. I'll request all the panelists to please address those as well as we go along. Dinesh ji, over to you.
Yeah, in fact, thank you, Aravind. In the limited time that we have, I think this should become a conversation with the people who have also raised.
Can you switch on your video, Dinesh, please? We can't see you.
Is it? 1 minute. 1 minute. Yeah.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
10
minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have.
Yeah.
I'll request you to stick to the time, and because we have many.
I will certainly request, but you haven't been able to get anybody to stick to it. But I will.
That I realize.
In fact, I'm more than happy to stick to 10 minutes as far as it's concerned, because I think there should be more time for discussion. Okay. I think a lot of important points have been already made, and that have set the stage, and I can really take them into account, and also take into account the questions that have arisen from that. See, the first thing that, planning process related public participation or urban governance related public participation can be a learning process. It can be used for the purpose of education, capacity building, and empowerment. All these are really the relevant outcomes, which I think friends have actually already underlined. But then, what should be the nature of learning and education process? There are challenges with regard to that, and I think questions right from the beginning, Bunu began to raise in the chat. Many of you might have seen those particular questions. And I think my understanding of the thing is that this learning process has to recognize not only the messiness, but the fact that there is already a challenge that the public administration, as well as mobilized publics, even forget about ordinary individual citizens, have become, victims, you can call them. They've accepted neoliberal imaginaries of urban planning. They have. I can give you examples when we started work with the, when we started work with the, in Gurgaon, which is, a city which was coming up only in the 80s as far as it's concerned, and is believed to have come up with an imagination that it can be a world-class city. It used to be a town of 5,000 people. It is really rapidly urbanized as well. City. It's now a metropolitan city, and that's why the Gurgaon Metropolitan Development Agency was to be formed. And when the public hearing was happening as far as it's concerned, we were there. And we found that, this particular consultation started with this almost a boundary stated by the municipal commissioner, who also later became the GMDA commissioner, and is even now the secretary of the urban department in state of Haryana, said plant growth is not possible. Actually, 30% of land use can only be planned. 70% of it is going to be unplanned. So please accept it. This is what he started with. Second, he said city cannot be actually dependent on its own resources. It has to get, metropolitan city has to get a lot of resources from outside, meaning it has to be extractivist. It has to get water from distant sources and so on, etc. And that depends on not a master plan. It depends on the imagination that there'll be 5 dams which were planned, I do not know, or ever even planned, to provide water to Gurgaon. And Gurgaon from 2012, which is almost 10 years now, has been, declared as a dark zone with regard to groundwater availability, and huge set of problems are there. But this particular public hearing, since began with these two imaginaries that what is possible is this only, and do not ask for more, required a contestation, required an engagement, and that's what. Recognizing what is the basis of today planning, and then it's not only educating or contesting with the public administration. It was also contestation with the RWAs, the middle class residents welfare associations, etc. They themselves believed in those very neoliberal imaginaries are concerned. I can get into the details of that. And they themselves had proposed a few dams on which they were depending, etc. And they were trying to undertake some litigation on the basis of that, but not attending to any local conservation. The catchment area was getting eroded every day. The urban planners, the real estate developers were in league and saying whatever rasta is available, which is called any vacant spot space is concerned, capture it as far as it's comes for real estate. Now, as a result, what was happening to it? Gurgaon was getting into the problem of water flooding as far as it's concerned. So see, when you are setting up a legislation of Gurgaon Metropolitan Development Agency, which is both a planning instrument as well as a governance instrument, you are faced with this particular challenge already, that the has been cast, that lot of commons which were privatized, in which there are urban villages, which meaning there were a lot of landowners who have lot of SUVs and so on, etc., from people who used to possess land, but that land was considered semi-arid and as a result not very productive. So as a result, they were willing to sell it, and that's how the DLF came up and developed that particular city. It could not have been done without the cooperation of those very farmers and so on, etc. So they were very much the audience of the neoliberal imaginaries as far as is concerned. So, and they control even today, if large number of migrants who are sitting in Gurgaon, as far as this, they are getting housing from whom? They are getting housing from precisely these very urban villages, which are called, and which are controlled by those very farmers who made money. And sometimes, of course, the joke is that they had the SUVs, they have married also, so on, etc. After that, all their children, etc. But they don't have money to put in those particular SUVs to put diesel into it, even as far as it's concerned. So they can't even take their wives outside as far as it's concerned. That's the kind of, it used to be a joke told to us by the very landowners themselves as far as it's concerned. We have lost. And so they've lost because of those very imaginaries, but at the same time, the die is cast, and that area gets urban flooded altogether as far as it's concerned. And they are not allowing even the local people who have come to live in these areas, the migrants from Bihar, Jharkhand, and whatnot, etc., are not able to contest at all. They are totally under control. Citizenship to all of them is a chimera at the moment, as far as it's concerned. If you do not politically mobilize them, precisely through this particular, about these imaginaries that what are guiding today the collective planning, the education process is not complete. Second, look at that very Gurgaon, was seen as a world-class city as far as it's concerned. But what is happening to it? It's It started with Maruti. It started with some of the various other international investments. Kaustuv was mentioning to me about, to us about the investment plans, and a huge amount of investment took place. But where did those investments go? Be it public investment or the private investment, did not go into any nature-based solution. They are themselves not implementing, in fact, any of those, whether dual use of water supply, resource recovery, anything, water, one can really get into the details, and that's not the purpose of this meeting today, to get into details of all that, etc. But simply that keep that in mind as far as is concerned, that this particular imaginary is today now in such a manner that if corrections have to be done, firstly, their own imagination about urban planning itself has to undergo a big change. This messiness has to be tackled with all these actors. These actors are not ready-made citizens who are, informed by values of justice and equity and so on, etc. This is a contestation. This is an engagement which is required. How does one carry it out is not an ordinary challenge to me. I'm glad that a lot of good examples were given both by Kaustuv as well as by Marina. And I think they're very important learning experience. I can add to their learning experience as far as is concerned. And if you look at that, Kirtibai started with this understanding that, these cities are engines of, prosperity. To me, many of these cities have now stagnated. In fact, none of these investments are coming. Those investments are very extractivist. As I said, infrastructure, the way God built it in this particular area. Now, even in fact, Noida has better prices compared to Gurgaon. In terms of even property prices, if you look at it in that particular manner. The planning process itself is requires not, then a kind of organizational effort, participation in public planning process. Multi-class alliances have to be built. In fact, the corporators in GMDA or in the MCG, but MCG came up only in 2008, and whereas the plan DLF began its effort in Gurgaon in 1980, 28 years it took as far as it's concerned. And even now, the last 12 years, the engagement that we have had with the corporators themselves, they say, we don't have any powers. It's the commissioner who has the powers as far as it's concerned. And that's talking of both planning and governance. They're concurrent processes. It's not that the master plan ends the process. The planning process continues as far as it's concerned. The question of building local area plans as far as it's concerned, it's a challenge which will have to be very, very politically tackled. As I suggested to you, that these very villages, as well as the areas which commons which have been privatized, where the upper middle class and the middle class today lives, as far as is concerned, has developed a certain kind of messiness and a contradictoriness, which is not an ordinary thing for any urban planner. Whether even Kirtibai comes, he would have a challenge which would not be easy to resolve as far as it's concerned. So this politics, this dynamics of politics is what, how do we carry it out? So then we had tried this Gurgaon Citizen Charter. Brought all the people, I am Gurgaon, Gurgaon city, etc., etc. And I'm making a generic point as far as is concerned. What does this multi-class alliance started with? It didn't insert the interest of the marginalized people. You had to push that interest as far as is concerned. They were in fact looking at them as problems. Only the COVID period, as far as is concerned, some empathy developed in this area, and we could get this organizations to join hands to say, okay, let us at least not allow these people to staff. And after that, MDI, the Management Development Institute, which has been an institute right from the almost early mid-80s there, as far as it's concerned, began to become a forum where we got people together who had become even part of the COVID process. The point which I'm trying to bring out is building a multi-class alliance, getting them to see a collective interest of marginalized people, or public interest to see, whether in environmental justice terms or in social justice terms, is a huge political process as far as it's concerned. And I think Marina was very right, or Kaustuv was very, very right. It can be a huge learning experience. I have no doubt about it as far as it's concerned. But how does one carry out this particular process when we have become consumers of that very neoliberal imaginaries in a manner that we are reproducing every day that very city. That city is a horrible city in many ways now as far as it's concerned, though being dreamt of, because it's source of all kinds of problems, and COVID period just brought that particular thing out. I think the story one can, say, okay, this had to involve a lot of knowledge production. We have taken for the last 5 years, involved number of institutions in that. It's been a transdisciplinary process. People themselves have produced a huge amount of knowledge. I don't have the time to go into the way we went about producing that particular knowledge, whether it be about the quality of water, be the quality of ecosystem services, or be with regard to the challenge of how housing. Kirti Bhai, if you look at this particular whole city, how much land the poor people control? Very small. It is you and me who control much of the land as far as it's concerned. And within that land, within that boundary that you have to do this planning is itself a very, very challenge, big challenge as far as it's concerned, to me as far as it's concerned. How do we ensure that they exercise their rights, their entitlements as far as it's concerned? And even now, when the second wave of COVID has started, we have business as usual continues, be with regard to thinking on Delhi, or be with regard to the whole national capital region. 5 cities are being planned in the city without thinking about either carrying capacity or thinking about how these cities need to be developed as far as it's concerned. I hope this engagement which we will carry out now with the 2041 plan, whether at Delhi level or at the NCR level, should be seen as precisely not that this kind of challenge, it's more than messiness, it's a wicked problem. I see it as it's a wicked problem. There's so many full of contradictions as far as it's concerned. And each time the status quoists are able to assert their power as far as it's concerned. And I know when Aravind opens his the message is clear. I can go on to reflect on this whole process as far as it's concerned. With 2 more, see, finally you've got to create a new imaginary. That universal basic services. We are talking of these days direct income transfer, basic income. This is a paradigm which is coming up as far as it's concerned. But is that a resolution? Well, even whether 6,000 rupees for Kisan, or whether 10,000 rupees for a street vendor to build his livelihood, or when the city is itself dying. These cities are no more engines of prosperity. In fact, the investment is so dependent on what happens in United States and European Union, and new investments are not going to come into these particular cities in a manner that one can actually think of qualitatively undergoing a change. I think the accumulation regime that is there as a larger structure, how does one engage with that particular process? It's in that context that the planning participation right issue has to be framed and problematized as far as it's concerned. That public engagement, that political engagement is what needs to be thought through, conceptualized in that particular manner. There are a whole set of actions at the moment planned, how Gurgaon we should intervene and the national capital region. I do not have time. I don't want to hear Unni, Aravind saying, Dinesh, time is up. Thank you.
Thank you for the very interesting points. Dinesh, we will come back to you on this. And now to kind of, because we are in the need for new imaginaries and new imaginations of how we want our cities to be. And at the moment, we seem to be playing within a certain restrictive sort of arena that's set by the state. So Fabricio and then later Mary. So over to you guys, because
just 1 second. And this is not really necessarily the process set by the state, what I described. The messiness, the contradictoriness, the wickedness is outside even when the process is not set by the state. Arvind, the challenge is much, much larger.
Much larger. Exactly. So are our counterparts and friends in other regions and locations in a position to kind of give new ideas of what's happening in their cities? Fabricio, over to you.
Okay, I have to share my screen, and Dinesh has to close his screen.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
No.
Done.
No, but you
Done,
have to,
Fabrico. Yeah, please do share your thing now.
you have to stop sharing your screen, Dineshji. And you do that.
Okay,
Yeah,
I have done that. Okay, sorry. That was also an act required. One more click. Kaustuv talked about clicking. Yeah.
Are you seeing my screen?
Not as yet,
No.
Fabricio. No. No, Oliveira, not as yet.
Let me come back. Well,
Fabricio,
share
if you
screen. I have to share screen. Is that? Click on share screen.
Ankisha,
Maybe let Ankisha share it.
Ankisha, please go ahead and share the screen.
Okay,
Fabricio, you can
Ankisha, pass for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Arvind, can I come in for a second?
Okay,
Arvind?
okay.
Arvind?
What?
Yeah, Kirtiji, of course, please come in.
No, the reason is this, that, we already, I know this is how I started, but we already have finished 2 hours. We have 2 speakers left. They have not spoken a word, and both of them have allowed. And therefore, we will have to kind of do some kind of planning. I'm not saying that you curtail the presentation of 2 foreigners, but I think, be careful in terms of how do you, because even if you go half an hour more, I think even half an hour will not be enough. So please, please kind of plan it properly. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay. Good morning, good afternoon to all. I would like to thank for the invitation to participate in this meeting. It's a pleasure and a rare opportunity for me to listen and talk with colleagues from India and Philippines. Like Delhi, Rio de Janeiro is starting a process of revising its master plan and has opened a virtual process of discussion with the population. I am not enthusiastic about this project because today, with an epidemic that kills about 4,000 people in a single day in Brazil, and Rio is one of the cities with the most deaths, how are we going to do a decent planning process? Who can now participate in the virtual planning process? Who is healthy? There is a huge inequality in access to internet. Most of the poor only access the internet via cell phones with very bad connections. And prepare a master plan now means leaving out exactly who suffered most from coronavirus pandemic and from the inequality in the distribution of urban equipment and services in our city. We should wait another year. That said, let's go ahead. I will speak here briefly about participation in urban planning in Brazil and next about urban planning in Rio de Janeiro, seeking to discuss the relationship between popular insurgencies and participation in discussion spaces created by the state. After the approval of the Federal Constitution in 1988 and 11 years later, the federal law known as the City Statute, the elaboration of participatory master plans gradually gained centrality in the national discussion. However, as a national research conducted between 2006 and 2009 shows, there is no reason for optimism with respect to master plans produced after the enactment of the City Statute. I need to say that in Brazil, master plans are laws approved by the City Council. The new Brazilian master plans in general are not very objective and do not even emphasize the promotion of access to housing for the low-income population. There are exceptions, of course, especially in municipalities governed by parties more to the left in the political field. Many processes have resulted in the creation of municipal councils for urban policies, as well as instruments that would allow greater social control over urban planning. But generally, Much is deliberated on what is not very important and nothing or very little on the fundamental themes for access to urbanizing land and the city. Even the processes of participation and elaboration of this new master plan shows the fragility of these supposed advances. The participation rarely go beyond holding 2 or 3 public hearings and general consultations with the populations that have little influence on the resulting urban laws. In fact, since the 90s, participation has become a motto defended by everyone, and practically everything goes through a process of discussion to legitimize proposals that not rarely, in our case, arrive practically ready. And what happens in Rio de Janeiro? Please, the next slide, please. Like other Brazilian cities, our urban planning processes have generally been opaque to popular participation and very generous to the local business community. From 1993 onwards, with the beginning of the strategic planning process according to the Barcelona model, the articulation of City Hall with the business community becomes even more dense, and the city is now seen as a business. The priority is to sell the city, attract investments, jobs, and a solvable population. Everything else is secondary. But the complexity of politics, the electoral process, and the urgencies of the population build a conflictive environment where even a manipulated planning process deserves to be disputed. But here in Rio, even that is rare. Generally, what we see are decisions concentrating on the mayor and his political group in association with private partners, not rarely resulting in a series of social environmental impacts. In fact, the poorest people often have to defend themselves from municipal laws, to defend themselves from plans, from decisions that affect their lives without any consultation, and often also without even adequate information. And this resistance can also come in the form of planning. And this is what I want to highlight here very quickly, citing 2 examples of popular planning experiences. The first is the popular plan of Vila Autódromo, and the second is the popular plan for Vargas. The next slide, please. 10 years ago, Vila Autódromo, you can do more, two clicks more. 10 years ago, Vila Autódromo was a small popular settlement with about 1,200 residents who, since the 90s, had been making a very strong resistance against several initiatives of removal promoted by Rio de Janeiro City Hall. The situation is aggravated when, in 2011, the City Hall mobilized to eradicate the community for the implantation of the Olympic Park and the land adjacent to the community. And one of the resistance strategies of the Vila Autódromo Residents Association was, alongside demonstrations, legal disputes, events, parties, etc., the elaboration of an alternative popular plan that proved that the community did not threaten the 2016 Olympics and that no residents needed to be removed. Our research and extension group at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro was invited to assist residents in preparing this popular plan. The next slide, please. The popular plan presented proposals for urbanization, provision of public services, cultural activities, etc. It was revised and revised again, and all the time residents have had updated alternative proposals to counter the City Hall removal project. The next slide, please. In the end, only 20 families managed to stay, with compensation for the population removed for the first time in cases of residents of low-income settlement reached values close to market prices. The most affected were the first family who accepted the City Hall's initial proposal to relocate them to a nearby housing estates, which is also rare, since the poor are usually removed tens of kilometers away from the places of origin. Next slide, please. In 2016, we are called by a group of residents to support the elaboration of a plan for a region about 50 square kilometers threatened by a municipal law project that stimulated real estate promotion and environmental depredation. Here, the idea was also to produce an alternative plan to the project of Rio de Janeiro City Hall, a plan based on the issues and values of the local population. Our advisory involved a training course for popular planners and participation in meetings, group discussions, and assemblies. Next slide, please. As a result, residents discussed and approved the popular plan for Vargas, which included proposals to change the urban legislations, to change road existing proposals and other issues not considered by the City Hall related to the preservation of local cultures and identities, defense of agroecology, and inclusion of a gender perspective in the formulation of public policies. Next slide, please. But as you know, even though popular plans and other action strategies are almost always organized against authoritarian measures conducted by the state, in the vast majority of cases, state intervention with investments, regulation, regularization is necessary for the victory of popular mobilization. And so residents and movements, in addition to their autonomous processes, need to participate in spaces built by the states, the invited spaces of, even if manipulated by governments, a theme studied in the early 80s by John Forrester. And the struggle here is for the perversion of the logic that guides the organization of these spaces and seeks to control its results. For its part, the City Hall seeks to interfere in the autonomous processes of mobilization to delegitimize the spaces invented by residents and activists by fomenting internal dissensions, producing misinformation, co-opting certain actors, etc. The question then becomes how to work, the next slide, please. The question now becomes how to work on this tense, contradictory relationship, how to participate in the invented spaces and maintain the autonomy, how to participate in the invited spaces and maintain the autonomy of the invented spaces, and also in relation to the performance of our university research and extension group. What is the role of advisory in these cases, especially in relation to the strategies of disinformation and control of supposedly participatory state space? And there is a great deal of work here, not only in relation to the production of other information, as John Forrest already showed us, but also with respect to technical criticism of government projects and other things. And here, arguments about respecting difference and local specificities are fundamental, as well as efforts to show that in reality, some issues are not exactly particular. In fact, they concern everyone. They would therefore be collective causes, especially when referring to the investment decisions or precarious investments by the City Hall in areas of popular housing. It is necessary, therefore, that the most diverse associations do not restrict their action or their reflection to the invited spaces coordinated by the City Hall, normally directed to give a superficial vanish of participation that legitimate proposals supposedly exclusively technical prepared by the City Hall, while devaluing information and other forms of knowledge and perspectives that residents and activists can bring to the discussion. When preparing master plans, it is essential that the population create their own spaces for preparing diagnoses and formulating proposals, even if they are limited or fragmented, and that these diagnoses and proposals are brought up and defended in forums coordinated by the state. Anyway, I could talk a little more, but I think we are out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Fabricio, for the very interesting work that you're doing and the engagements there in Rio. I will request now Mary to share her experience and the civil society and people's engagement experience from Philippines, Manila. Mary, are you there?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Mary.
All right. Now, oh, sorry. Yes. All right. Now, thank you. I'm very glad to be here, especially because my friend Kirti Shah has invited me, and we haven't really connected until many, many years, but I'm happy to be here. So let me say the Philippine experience, as I listen to all of you and you're talking about master plans, I'm thinking, when have we ever had a master plan? All of the participatory processes that I've been involved with community groups, informal settler organizing, has been in the situation, and let me start with this, next slide. Here, this is just an example of tremendous crowding. Metro Manila is 11 million people, and it's now expanded to what we call Mega Manila, the 4 provinces around, where private developers have also moved in there. So you have anywhere from 15 to 18 million just contiguous populations. Next slide. All right, so let me start there. That what we found is that participatory planning is most successful in poor communities when they're organized. Right? If they're not organized, then they become the ploy of whoever wants to deal with different groups in the community. So organization is crucial. And what we've found is that people organize when they perceive a threat. Usually that threat is eviction. And the eviction is going to be even some, as already pointed out in Brazil, distant places, 40 kilometers outside where they really cannot survive, even though there is actual housing and so on. So, but they will organize to resist. That is when they get involved. When there's an issue, they have to fight to stop the lives that they have, to stop from making it even worse in terms of access to basic services, the land situation, but where they have a thriving community because they've been there for 30, 40, 50 years as informal settlers and have built up their housing themselves, but it's ramshackle or depends on how long they've been there, but they have a sense of community. They know where the hospital is, the school, their children go to the school nearby. They know whom to borrow and lend from when they need an extra money, who their friends are. So it's a very lively community. But but when they face resistance or eviction, that's not enough. That is when we found that when organizers go in to help them come together to face the issues that come with government desire to acquire where they are or to kick them off that land. So when they perceive a threat that requires some kind of unified reaction from them, then they very much welcome community organizers. And these are usually NGO groups or leftist political groups who are also quite active in that role. So what does it entail? It means you have to level the playing field. There has to be a way in which people who are victimized, who are exploited and so on for many years have limited power, but are thriving with little support from government, but they're surviving and they're hoping that their children have a better life than they because they're doing this and that. But the idea that you need to address power relations, level the playing field. And for people who have been poor for a long time and vulnerable, what we call breaking the culture of silence is crucial. How is that done? Well, through organizing. Of course, we promote nonviolent conflict, confrontation, nonviolence, but confrontation and not to be afraid of conflict. Conflict in the sense of arguing, fighting. In other words, demand making. The posture is demand making, and you have a right to demand. Get that into their picture. So just to be quiet is going to undermine you. You will be forced off unless you speak up. But how do you do that? And once you get certain victories, you succeed, it's your victory. You claim it. The NGOs who helped or whoever came in, we never can claim that. It's your victory. And that gives them a realization that they can do things, right? Next. That they can achieve when they have a voice. Next. Here's an example. In the early days, well, until now, anytime you have an impending eviction, they mobilize to fight, and they have all kinds of ways. And the Metropolitan Police are there. Sometimes they stand off. Sometimes the local government breaks up their shacks. But it's a never-ending cycle of this, unless they get beyond that, this is their what they know how to do. But if that energy and can be brought into more strategic kinds of ways of resisting and coming into getting to know what does the government, how does it operate, and how can we get into the weaker parts of the government or where we have friends in government and build up the connection so that we have friends in government who will help us to resist this kind of police confrontation. Next. Okay, let me just say I've been in this for a long time, since the 60s. And there's a big difference now between the early years of organizing and maybe the organizing after what we call People Power 1986, the overthrow of the Marcos administration, when President Aquino Cory came in and the whole democratic space opened up again. So the first part of organizing was you have to get people to be unified around issues which are very local, which is mainly not to be relocated, but to stay and get the notion of what does it take to say on site or near site. That was what organizers said, you have a right to that, but helping them think through and to know what does that actually mean. The thing is with long-term organizing for rights to stay in the community, because it's such a bureaucratic process with government, if they're listening, you have to make sure that they have small issues that they can win. Just putting in 3 more water taps and getting the water administration finally to do that because you confront them right in your offices. You bring your kids with chocolate on their hands and get all over the tables of the administrators and things like that. Very creative strategies, but small scale because they have to win something. Otherwise, they get very discouraged. They have to win and realize that they can do it, right? That they have the capacity and that they can speak up. There's a lot of role playing that goes into it. These are some of what we call the famous 10 steps, but I won't go into those details. But it means that they identify the issues that they need to tackle. What are the long-term ones, which is housing and on-site? What are the shorter-term ones that they can actually handle? And what the NGO roles are is to bring in the technical people who can help them, whether it's housing design, if they're building on-site, or everything else. Next. So it's a lot of meetings, a lot of explanations, but you need a lot of tactics also. So how do you get people to be feeling that they have a voice? We in the Philippines, it's a Christian or Catholic country. During Christmas, we have the Search for the Inn. During Holy Week, we have the Calvary process. Together with the communities and a very good street theater NGO, they work out, all right, what are the issues they want to get to the government by this kind of procession? It's a religious procession. It's part of the tradition that you do have a procession and prayers during these 2 crucial times of the year. But they also turn it into the issues that they're saying, this is why we're suffering during the Calvario or Calvary of Holy Week. Here, just as Jesus suffered, we are suffering, and we are suffering. And some of what these crosses say is, you have brought fear in Takot, is fear in our communities, because at that time, the extrajudicial killings on drugs were very, very strong, still there, but that was an issue. The death penalty, which of course always affects them the most, which was the Congress was trying to bring that back. Stopping democracy is one of them. And then this Nanlaban is the ultimate. That was the big cross that they actually put up, and a guy was tied to it. And what in the church biblical side, that top sign says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, right? But they put instead Nanlaban because that's the standard government excuse for why they had to shoot thousands of urban poor, so-called drug addicts, because they fought, right? They fought the police, therefore the police had to shoot them dead. And and so that term then became the term of derision, actually, just as, INRI in the Bible was to show how false that was. Anyway, so these are the kinds of things. And the street dramas, it was a great process. There was a lot of, and children are there, the whole city comes to see it, and they portray certain things. During the Christmas one, the search for the inn is, of course, a search for a house, a search for land that we can be, and family, and Christ, the child is born into what kind of society. So they draw on the expression of the famous Christian rituals to bring out their issues. And it's a very dramatic, of course, people take notice. The media love this kind of thing. So when they finish with that, they do always a review of every time they have an action, and they're always so excited and thrilled what they were able to accomplish. So it's that building of self-confidence, recognizing that we have power and we can do it. That's what participation then becomes something serious, right? Next. Oh, I have to go faster. Next. Here's another picture. And notice the men and women, women very significant in the whole organizing process and leadership at local levels, community levels. This was the train law. That was another year. Stop demolition, right? That was another cross. Well, the extrajudicial killings is another cross. So the drama of the message comes through very strongly. Next. Well, that's more on how do you get communities to organize, especially in the beginning when they're not organized in that way. They have all kinds of small-scale association, the Garlic Peelers Association, the street vendors, but bringing all of those together into one community-based action, that's the aim. Next. All right, so, but in the later years, this is very interesting. Once the democratic space opens up and government is interested in supporting it, and after when the Marcos period was finally overthrown, many of those who got into the Cory Aquino government were NGOs. She brought many of them in because she felt that they were close to how people want to live. And they were very significant in changing the orientation of many of the government offices to listen and to regard what people are saying. So the political part makes a big difference. They're still, they're still resisting relocation. But now they are organized, and we call them people's organizations, the POs. We distinguish the NGOs from the POs, people's organizations. But the task is now different or has expanded. They need technical knowledge. If they're saying we need to have the flooding is terrible, we need to redo the canals, they have to learn the technology of that, because if they're going to advocate it, they have to have in the people's plan a specific way in which they're going to do it, or the government has to support them. So technical knowledge becomes very important. If they're trying to resist distant relocation, they have to look, and they're right on the river, and they know they have to move back, and they themselves don't want to be flooded all the time. So they look for lots. They are totally, and it's mainly the women who are doing, they look for empty spaces somewhere near them, find out who owns that, and then try to negotiate with the government to purchase that lot, and then and get access to funding. Next. Okay, and this was a very dramatic thing. During the while the President Aquino, the son Aquino, was running for president, they decided finally they have to get into politics. Before, they stayed out of political elections, right? The election process. But they realized if we don't get into the election process, we won't going to be heard. So they figured that he was likely to win. They put their eggs all into his basket. And they said, the whole alliance said, we will vote for you as president if you agree to these points. All right. And there was a big meeting, and he was on the stage, and they presented, if you get in, we will be in your office on day one to say we need trabajo, employment, security of land, basic services, a community mortgage program for some of them, decent schools and health clinics, suspend these, an EO which was very vindictive, good housing and health, karapatan, human rights, and to give preference and priorities to the needs of the poor. And they had that all in a piece of paper, discussed it with them. He said, well, you know, this I can't do, this I can do, but all right, this I'll sign, but you know that on points 5 and 6 or whatever, it's going to be a problem. But in principle, I agree. And he signed. And so he won. And you can be sure, day 2, they were ready to go. I mean, that's the kind of thing, the demand process that they have rights. But to get to that stage takes a long time. Next. Oh, I'm conscious of this speed. Right. Next. All right. What does it take? You have to. Oh, all right. So here's again, now that this president, President Aquino, the son, was quite open, and his officials were quite open. He had great people in you know, the housing sector, parts of the housing sector. So communities began to prepare people's plans, right? We call it the people's plan about your community, because that's what they're interested. They really don't care. What's not in their mind is how does the whole city look? They just want to be sure that their place is the way it should be for them. And now the government was open, they learned how you have to do planning. So hundreds of meetings to figure it all out and to, you know, negotiate, confront this and that government entity to see. So it's sort of 5 steps forward and 3 steps back. But this is the process over the years. It takes a long time, but you know, it was happening. And next, I can show you some of the. All right, so this is you know, the message now in the later part of the, you know, of organizing is you have rights. You know, you couldn't say that much at the beginning. That was too difficult, you know, so alien concept to them at the beginning. But because of all of this experience of organizing and gaining victories here and there, they themselves began to say, wait a minute, hey, we have rights. We have rights to land, to affordable housing, to participation, and you have to treat us with dignity and respect. You know, we are citizens of this country. We are citizens who have a right to the city. So they, you know, their notion of moral politics, that we care for one another, we help one another during emergencies, which is virtually every day. So we're good people. Stop telling us we're terrible people and criminals and this and that. So just building up their recognition of themselves, you know, as very moral people, even though they're told all the time, all you're doing that's all illegal. And they say, no, it helps everybody to move up together, right? All right, so the formation now with many communities organized with people's organizations, alliances across the city, which makes a huge difference now in cities because they know, the mayor knows and the national government knows, you know, Metro Manila, the same place, that they have to contend with large groups who are going to be very outspoken. So they're learning how to deal with you know, bigger and bigger issues, and academe finally is coming in to try to write some of this up. Unfortunately, most of the material on all of this is in the so-called gray literature, NGO, little reports here and there, little booklets here and there, but the academic community hasn't much until recently shown much interest. They don't know how to connect. So I keep trying to say, the NGOs will connect, just come and do a co-production study with the people of an issue that they need to solve that you can help. So change this orientation of academics, that you study them, but it's that you're a partner with them in co-production, co-ownership, and co-benefits, right? Next. I think that's the end. Next. Yeah, and here's some of the process. This is Mangahan Floodway. Well, there are 2 of them. Can you get the back one? This is now built. There are 10 of these sets, and it's housing people who are along the river. And in terrible circumstances, they found this lot, which was a government lot, just across the street from them, practically. And they lobbied with the Aquino government uh, people who were very supportive and managed to get the bureaucracy to provide, well, the president, by the way, I should say, right from the beginning, allocated 50 billion pesos, which is $1 billion US dollars for social housing, which means this for these communities. And so these communities took advantage of that from his own personal presidential funds. And and with the bureaucracy that were friendly, they managed to get this constructed. But from the beginning, they said, we have to be involved in the design and we will supervise the construction. Many of them were given jobs there and so on. So now there are, I think, 8 or 10 of these housing a huge number of people who used to be in the river. Next, and this is the last one, I think. So this is another one, the Estero de San Miguel, which used to be one of the worst slum communities right on a canal. They finally, through negotiations, agreed to move back to a very narrow strip, which is this, and with the help of architects who we called in, who helped them design, and they supervised the design and so on. They finally moved in, but there was an overflow, so they looked for another lot, and they found a government lot near the presidential palace, and they managed to get that allocated to 3 different informal settlements in the area, whom they mobilized themselves. So now it's the POs helping to mobilize other POs. The NGO role has been relegated to technology, connections, linking them with government people who know what they ought to do, and so on. So finally, I mean, of course, now we have this president who is not exactly oriented to people's participation. However, we have an election next year. So we are hopeful that we will have a state which is supportive of people. But let me just say the last thing is, I talked to one of the women who was in one of those other apartments, which was now full, and she said, last statement, she said, I'm really so happy here. My children can go to school here decently, and so on. It's so when it rains, I'm not terrified anymore that my house might be washed away. But then she looked at me and she said, but they, which is some government people in this administration, they still think of us as squatters. We moved from squatters, we became informal settlers. And from informal settlers, we're now homeowners, registered. We're members of the Homeowners Association, but they still look at us as squatters. What can we do about that? And so there is part of the struggle still to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, for the very interesting points, and to kind of bring our attention back to the fact that it is organizing and it is work in the community that sets the foundation for any action to happen on let's say master planning and governance. So really loved your points and Fabricio's point on how do we expand on what we have right now in the form of invited spaces, but how do we craft out new arenas or new invented spaces that the people and the communities and the civil society has to create for themselves. So I spoke to Kirti ji, and Kirti had suggested that we stick to, let's say, a couple of questions that we pose to our friends. For all other questions, maybe we will have to we'll take and respond to them over email or some other form at a later point. So one question that I would want to especially ask all our Indian friends and counterparts is, of what do you think would be the laws that, the question that Raju Bisi has raised here, what would we think would be the laws and the policies that have to change if at all more participatory spaces are to be created? Any of our friends would, let's say Kaustuv ji, if you would want to, because you were not able to speak about UD RFPI guidelines, so I thought maybe if you're able to point on that.
Well, I'm not sure that a particular law in itself would solve this problem. But of course, when it is sort of presented in a kind of legal format, then it becomes rights. And therefore, it might be easier for the communities to ask for accountability from the state authorities, whether it is municipalities or the state government, the national government. The overarching framework is there in the 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, and then also in the Citizen Participation Law. Now, what is kind of suggested is a guideline under the URDA. So guideline becomes guidelines. You follow or don't follow. You are not. It's a kind of moral compass for the planners and the state authorities. But there is no legal. In a sense, the officials or planners are not legally bound to follow that. So there has to be a distinction between what is a guideline and what is a kind of a law. So my sort of own take is that unless we make citizen participation law mandatory in all the municipalities, all kinds of municipalities, whether it is municipal corporation, whether it is council or nagar panchayat, it has to be mandatorily. But unfortunately, this government and even the previous government were not very serious about the implementation of this community participation law. Now, there is also a kind of increasing tendency for centralization of everything, whether it is at the central level or at the state level. So these in a way further disempower the urban local bodies. And urban local bodies, even if they follow a participatory process, and if they want to accommodate the needs and aspirations of the people, they won't be able to do so because there is no control over resource allocation, which is sort of in a way controlled by the state and the national government. There is a discourse, new discourse that how a local resource mobilization can be further sort of enhanced. Capacities of the ULPs are enhanced in order to mobilize their own source revenue, but certain categories of municipalities can do only that much because the tax buoyancy or the ability to pay for services, which many a times is contradictory to the interest of many informal settlers. So therefore, we are sort of faced with a kind of real life challenge where we need to bring a legal framework, but at the same time, that enforcement is very much required. Let me stop there.
Perfect. Thank you for the interesting points. I will now request Kirti ji to kind of either put his comments or ask and take this towards a conclusion. Kirti ji. And we will come back to everyone with responding to the questions at a later point over email or through other modes of communication.
Hello, thank you. I think I obviously have a lot to say, but long list of things that I wanted to kind of come back on, but it's almost impossible. It's 7:45, 7:15, and we are 45 minutes ahead of time. So I'm going to kind of tell myself not to do anything of the sort and try and kind of finish this in the next 2 minutes by thanking the panel. It was a remarkably thoughtful, I think, webinar. And we've been planning it for a long time, and I'm extremely delighted that it happened. And it happened in such a wonderful way. Each one made a significant contribution. It brought out very clearly this huge amount of thinking that's happening. There is, of course, a lot to be done, but a very interesting beginning it seems to have happened. And we got to kind of go a long way and really pursue this. I also wanted to kind of ask this question that, except for what what Kaustubji talked about, this still seems to be essentially a big city process, Delhi and Mumbai and other cities. And I really think there's a huge possibility if this could be taken to smaller places. And I just wanted to ask Kaustuv, I think, because of the two cities they talked about, from the name of it appears as smaller cities. Is there a good chance of succeeding or really kind of taking this process ahead if you are doing in the smaller places? I'm not saying that it should not be done in big places, but there's so much to be done in the smaller places, and whether this would be possible. Other thing that I wanted to kind of bring to everyone, and I think people know about this, but I'm personally very deeply impressed with what is happening in Orissa at this point of time. So far, listening to the slum dwellers is concerned, starting from the political process, where there's a full-page advertisement with Patnaik saying evictions or empowerment. And they say, we are making a choice. And I think, a success kind of thing that they're doing in terms of legislation, in terms of program, in terms of outreach, in terms of mainstreaming of the community. And I think this is very important, because it's truly, in my understanding, what is happening is a bottom-up process, because they now are talking about redrawing map from this particular process onward, in terms of looking at slums, in terms of removing slum from that, and then using that processes to redo the master planning. And I think there is a lot to be learned. I wanted to share this at greater length, but we don't have time. So I thought I'll just mention that Orissa is a case that needs to be examined. Another small little point I wanted to make was this, that when you talk about master planning, when we talk about, I think, people's participation in planning processes, we're still talking about, and I think, event-based and activity-based thing. And as Marina pointed out, very important, this has to be ongoing process of listening to people. And we've got to find mechanisms, we've got to kind of find ways, we've got to find institutional structures which allow this to do this something. If that doesn't happen, we won't really kind of go very far, even if participation happens in plan A or plan B. Other thing that I wanted to mention very quickly is this, that in the last 10 years, if you look at the structures, and of course, on the one hand, you have Orissa, but just imagine 74th Constitutional Amendment. It was supposed to institutionalize this. It's now 27 years, and we are still talking about what to do with it. And therefore, you've got to look at that in the context of political processes. We've got to talk about, I think, willingness on political side in terms of instrumentality, which is available, and how it is not being taken forward. And in the context of India, we probably are in the reverse process compared to what Mary talked about. We are talking about a reversal of Korea Kino phase. It's a reversal. That is what is happening. And we are aware of that, and we're examining them. And we have got to kind of see how to respond to that. So having said that very quickly, let me thank each one of you personally, and it will be unjust not to mention you, Aravind, for tremendous effort to putting this together, getting everyone together. We've been working on this for months. Shalaka ji, I never met you ever before. You did enormous amount of work, and but for your effort, this would not have been possible. So thank you very much. Dinesh, as usual, thank you for coming, and thank you for keeping 10 minutes. I think you're the only one who did that. Kaustuv Saab, you were brilliant. Liked your analysis very much. As a matter of fact, there is so much that one must learn from you in terms of what is happening. This whole theoretical construct that you do are exceedingly important. Marina ji, I like your reflections very much. As a matter of fact, I wanted to go back on a reflection. We didn't have time, but they are very, very useful reflection in terms of looking at the whole thing in the context of justice and what we do with people. Rumi ji, you were very long, but very interesting, especially the thing that you brought out in terms of what's happening in Goa and smart city. Fabricio, thank you very much. And Mary, I wanted to tell you that this is your webinar because I just cannot get over that at 89 you just come back from teaching a course and putting up this incredibly forceful presentation. You are, I wrote to someone today that you are indestructible, you are unageable, and I think also is something else. So I think, you remain that. Thank you very much for inspiring all of us. So thank you very much, the panel, and thank you, Aravind, once again for doing this. As a matter of fact, I think we should have thought a little more. We should have divided this into 2 sessions. We should have done 2. We would have done greater justice to a very good subject. You never know. We'll see. Yeah. We'll talk about that. And let me thank my colleagues at studio. Of course, so before I forget, this is one webinar where we have 5 big partners, and I must thank them. We have IGSS, we have ORF, we have PRIA, we have Dilli, and YUVA, and of course INHAF. So there's 6 partners who have put this together, and I'm very happy with this partnership. Let me kind of end this, but thank you, my colleagues at Studio INHAF. Ankisha has just joined, and I think she does such remarkable work. I can't even believe how someone could take over so easily of a task which is rather complex. So thank you, Ankisha. Thank you, Alika. Thank you, Shamol. Thank you, Thea. Thank you, Neeta. And thank you, everyone.